Everyone believed she was the woman who lost everything. They never realized she was the one who protected everything. The rain fell softly over the Whitmore estate that evening, covering the long driveway with a silver glow as Victoria Bennett Whitmore stood near the entrance with a small suitcase in her hand. The house behind her was the place she once believed would become her forever home. It was where she had shared dreams, quiet mornings, and promises about a future together. But now, under the cold lights of the mansion, she was leaving without anger, without revenge, and without begging anyone to understand. She simply walked away with the dignity she had always carried. Years earlier, Victoria had entered the world of Alexander Whitmore, knowing exactly who he was. Alexander was not an ordinary man. He was a powerful businessman with a reputation built on discipline, intelligence, and control. Many people admired him. Many feared disappointing him. But Victoria saw something others rarely noticed. Behind the confident image was a man who had spent his life carrying responsibilities alone. She did not fall in love with his status. She fell in love with the person he was when nobody else was watching. For years, Victoria became the quiet strength behind Alexander's success. She remembered the details he forgot. She supported him during difficult moments. She celebrated his achievements even when nobody knew about her sacrifices. But inside the Whitmore family, not everyone saw her the same way. Some people looked at Victoria's plus-size figure before they ever noticed her kindness. Some judged her because she was a black woman entering one of the most traditional families in their circle. They questioned whether she belonged beside Alexander. They whispered that someone like her could never understand their world. Victoria heard those words, but she never allowed them to define her. She knew her worth. What hurt most was not the opinions of strangers. It was the silence of the man she loved. Alexander had always been skilled at handling business challenges, but he struggled to recognize emotional wounds. He believed that providing security was enough. He believed that loyalty was understood without being spoken. He never realized that the person standing beside him needed to feel valued, not just protected. The night Victoria left, Alexander remained inside the mansion, surrounded by everything he had built. He believed the situation would eventually calm down. He believed time would fix what words could not. He did not know that some moments could never be repeated. He did not know that Victoria was carrying a truth that would change everything, a truth she had chosen to protect, even when protecting it meant walking away alone. Months passed, and Alexander convinced himself that Victoria had simply chosen a different life. He told himself that she wanted distance. He told himself that she had moved on. But what he did not know was that every choice Victoria made was connected to a promise she had made long before that night. A promise to protect what mattered most. Then, years later, Alexander would see something that would stop him completely. Two children standing quietly in front of him. Two familiar faces. And around their necks was a necklace he knew better than anyone. A necklace that belonged to his mother. A necklace that carried a secret Victoria had kept for years. For years, Alexander Whitmore believed that silence meant peace. He thought that if a problem was not openly discussed, then perhaps it was not serious enough to change his life. But some truths do not disappear when ignored. They simply wait for the right moment to be revealed. After Victoria Bennett Whitmore walked away from the mansion, Alexander returned to the same routines that had always controlled his world. Meetings filled his calendar. Business decisions occupied his thoughts. People continued to respect his name. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside the walls of his home, something felt different. The quiet spaces reminded him of the person who used to fill them with warmth. Victoria had never demanded attention. She had never asked for recognition. She had simply been there, offering support in ways Alexander only noticed after they were gone. At first, he convinced himself that time would make the memories fade. But instead, small reminders appeared everywhere. A book she had once recommended sitting on a shelf. A handwritten note, hidden inside an old folder. A photograph from a family gathering where Victoria was smiling while everyone else was focused on Alexander. Each discovery showed him the same thing. She had been part of his life in ways he never fully understood. Meanwhile, Victoria had created a new life away from the Whitmore family. She did not leave because she stopped caring. She left because she finally understood that love should not require someone to constantly prove their worth. She found a peaceful home in a quiet neighborhood where nobody cared about her connection to Alexander Whitmore. The people around her knew her simply as Victoria. They saw her kindness, her patience, and her determination. They did not see her as someone's wife. They saw her as a person. Years passed, and Victoria built a life centered around what truly mattered. She focused on creating stability and protecting the family she had chosen. She never spoke badly about Alexander, even when others asked questions. She believed that children should not inherit the bitterness of adults. Alexander did not know this. He only knew that the woman who once stood beside him was gone. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Alexander attended a charity event connected to his mother's legacy. He expected a normal appearance, another evening of conversations and formal introductions. But as he entered the room, something caught his attention. Two young children were standing near the entrance, holding hands and looking around with quiet curiosity. There was something familiar about them that he could not explain. It was not only their appearance, it was the feeling they created. A feeling he had not experienced in years. Then he saw it. Around one child's neck was a small necklace with a design he recognized immediately. His mother's necklace. The same necklace she had treasured for decades. The same necklace she once said should only belong to someone who represented the heart of the Whitmore family. Alexander stood still, unable to understand what he was seeing. Questions filled his mind. How did those children have that necklace? Why had Victoria never told him anything? And what other truths had she carried alone? For the first time in years, Alexander realized that the story he believed was not the complete story. The woman he thought had simply left might have been protecting something far more important than he ever imagined. Alexander Whitmore had spent years believing that he understood every important detail of his life. He knew the numbers behind his businesses. He knew the people who worked for him. He knew the history of his family name. But standing in that quiet room, staring at the necklace that once belonged to his mother, he realized there was one story he had never truly understood. The story of Victoria Bennett Whitmore. The woman he thought he had lost was not a chapter he could simply close. She was the missing piece of a truth that had been waiting for years to be discovered. After the charity event, Alexander could not stop thinking about the children. Their names were Ethan and Emma. They were polite, curious, and surprisingly comfortable around the people who surrounded them. But what affected Alexander most was not the resemblance or the necklace. It was the way they carried themselves. They had the same quiet confidence he remembered from Victoria, a calm strength that did not need attention. Alexander began searching for answers, but this time, he approached the situation differently. In the past, he would have used his influence to control the outcome. He would have demanded information and expected immediate results. But something inside him had changed. He understood that this was not a business problem. This was a family matter, and family required honesty, not control. Eventually, Alexander found Victoria. She was no longer the woman standing silently beside him at formal events. She had grown into someone who carried herself with confidence and peace. She lived in a modest but welcoming home, where photographs filled the walls and warmth filled every corner. When Alexander saw her again, he expected anger. He expected disappointment. Instead, he found calmness. That surprised him more than anything. "You look different," Alexander said quietly. Victoria smiled. "I learned how to become myself again." Those words stayed with him, because deep down, Alexander knew what she meant. During their marriage, Victoria had spent so much time supporting his world that she had slowly disappeared inside it. She had been the person everyone depended on, but rarely the person anyone asked about. Alexander looked around the room and noticed small details that told a bigger story. The children's drawings on the refrigerator, the books arranged neatly on shelves, the simple moments that represented years of love and care, a life he had not been part of. "Why did you never tell me?" Alexander finally asked. Victoria looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I knew what would happen if I came back before you understood." Alexander felt the weight of those words. She was not trying to punish him. She was not trying to make him feel guilty. She was telling him that some things could not be repaired until someone was ready to accept the truth. Victoria explained that after leaving the Whitmore estate, she focused on creating a stable life for the children. She wanted them to grow up knowing kindness, not conflict. She wanted them to understand that their worth did not come from a powerful family name. It came from who they were. Alexander listened carefully because for the first time, he was not searching for a way to defend himself. He was searching for a way to understand. Then Victoria revealed something that changed the way he viewed the past. The necklace was not given to the children by accident. It was a promise connected to his mother, a promise Victoria had kept because she believed some family traditions were about love, not status. Alexander looked at the necklace again and finally understood. The person he had once allowed others to overlook had been protecting a piece of his family's heart all along. Alexander Whitmore had spent years believing that the hardest decisions were the ones made in boardrooms, where every choice had a number attached to it and every outcome could be measured. But sitting across from Victoria Bennett Whitmore, he discovered that the most difficult truths were the ones that required him to look honestly at himself. For the first time in his life, Alexander had no strategy, no prepared answer, and no way to hide behind his reputation. He was simply a man facing the consequences of the moments when he failed to see the person who loved him most. Victoria watched him quietly as he processed everything. She remembered the years when she had stood beside him, believing that patience and loyalty would eventually be recognized. She remembered the celebrations where everyone praised Alexander, while nobody noticed the person who helped him reach those moments. But she also remembered why she stayed silent. She never wanted their children to grow up surrounded by resentment. She wanted them to know that kindness was stronger than bitterness. Alexander looked at Ethan and Emma as they played nearby, completely unaware of the emotional weight of the conversation happening around them. He noticed the small details that reminded him of Victoria. The way they listened carefully, the way they treated others with respect, the way they carried confidence without needing attention. Those qualities did not come from wealth or family reputation. They came from the values Victoria had given them. "You raised them alone," Alexander said softly. Victoria looked toward the children before answering. "I raised them with love. That was the most important thing." Her response affected him deeply because it showed there was no anger in her heart. She was not trying to make him feel guilty. She was simply explaining the life she had built after walking away. Alexander realized something painful. Victoria had not left because she stopped caring about him. She left because she cared enough to protect what mattered. She protected the children. She protected the memory of his mother, and in some ways, she protected him from continuing to live without understanding the people around him. Later that evening, Alexander learned more about the necklace. His mother had given it to Victoria years before their separation. It was not a symbol of status or wealth. It represented acceptance. His mother had seen something in Victoria that others ignored. She saw compassion, strength, and a heart that could hold a family together. Alexander remembered how often he had allowed other voices to influence his decisions. He remembered moments when Victoria needed support, and he chose silence because speaking up would have created conflict. Those memories were difficult because they showed him that his biggest mistake was not a single action. It was a pattern of overlooking someone who deserved to be seen. "Why did you keep this from me for so long?" Alexander asked. Victoria took a moment before responding. "Because I needed to know if you would come looking for us, because you wanted control, or because you finally understood." Her words stayed in the air. Alexander knew there was truth in them. The old version of himself would have focused on what he had lost. He would have worried about his name, his image, and what others would think. But now, he was thinking about what Victoria and the children had experienced without him. For the first time, he was not asking how to bring them back into his life. He was asking how to become someone worthy of being part of theirs. And that difference changed everything. Alexander Whitmore had spent years believing that admitting mistakes would make him appear weak. In his world, leaders were expected to remain confident, decisive, and untouchable. But standing in front of Victoria Bennett Whitmore and their children, he discovered that true strength required something he had avoided for most of his life. It required humility. The days after their reunion were not filled with dramatic promises or easy forgiveness. Alexander understood that years of distance could not disappear because of one conversation. Trust was not rebuilt through words alone. It was rebuilt through patience, consistency, and actions that proved his intentions were genuine. Victoria noticed that difference. The man who once tried to solve every problem with influence and control was learning to slow down. He was learning to listen. He was learning that being present mattered more than simply providing. Alexander began spending time with Ethan and Emma, not as a powerful figure trying to reclaim a place in their lives, but as a father trying to understand the children he had missed. He discovered their favorite books, their small routines, and the little things that made them smile. For the first time, he experienced moments that could not be measured by success or achievement. They were simple moments, but they meant more than any business victory he had ever celebrated. Victoria watched carefully. She appreciated the effort, but she remained cautious. She had built a peaceful life without depending on Alexander, and she refused to return to the past without seeing real change. She did not want a temporary version of him created by regret. She wanted to know if the person standing before her was truly different. One evening, Alexander asked Victoria a question he had never asked before. What was the hardest part? Victoria looked at him quietly. She knew exactly what he meant. The hardest part was not leaving, she said. The hardest part was realizing that I could be beside someone every day and still feel invisible. Her answer stayed with him, because deep down, Alexander knew that was the truth he had been avoiding. He had not abandoned Victoria through one cruel decision. He had abandoned her through countless small moments when he failed to notice her feelings. He had allowed others to make her feel like she did not belong, and his silence had become an answer. Alexander apologized, but this time he did not expect forgiveness immediately. I know saying sorry does not change what happened, he said. I know I cannot give you back the years we lost, but I want to spend the years ahead becoming someone who deserves the trust I once ignored. Victoria listened carefully. She saw the difference between the man speaking now and the man she remembered. Before, Alexander apologized because he wanted the pain to end. Now, he apologized because he finally understood the pain he caused. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family began facing their own reflection. The people who once judged Victoria based on her appearance and background began seeing the truth they had ignored. They saw a woman who had protected their family's legacy with kindness rather than power. They saw a mother who raised two wonderful children with patience and love. They realized that the person they underestimated was the person who had carried the values their family claimed to represent. Alexander knew there was still a long road ahead. Some relationships could not be repaired overnight. Some wounds needed time. But for the first time, he was willing to walk that road without expecting anything in return. He had spent years building an empire that the world admired. Now he was learning how to build something far more important. A family based not on reputation, but on respect. Alexander Whitmore had spent most of his life believing that protecting his family meant protecting their reputation. He thought a strong family was one that appeared flawless from the outside, one that showed the world confidence and success. But after everything he discovered about Victoria Bennett Whitmore, he finally understood that a family was not defined by appearances. It was defined by the people who stayed when things became difficult. The days that followed were filled with small moments that changed Alexander more than any major event ever could. He began learning about the life Victoria had built while he was focused on everything except what truly mattered. He saw the morning routines she created for Ethan and Emma. He saw the patience she showed when they asked endless questions. He saw the kindness she offered to neighbors and strangers without expecting anything in return. These moments revealed a side of Victoria that he had always overlooked. She was never simply the woman who supported his journey. She was a person with her own strength, dreams, and values. Alexander realized that the mistake he made was believing her sacrifices existed only because of her love for him. He failed to understand that her compassion was part of who she was. One afternoon, Alexander and Victoria sat together while the children played nearby. For once, there was no discussion about the past or the mistakes that separated them. They simply talked about the present. "I used to think I lost everything when you left," Alexander admitted. "But now I realize you were the one who lost the most, and I never stopped to ask how you felt." Victoria looked at him carefully. She could see the sincerity in his expression, but she also understood that healing required more than emotional conversations. "The person I needed years ago was not someone who could fix everything," she said. "I needed someone who would stand beside me and see me." Alexander nodded because he finally understood. Victoria had never needed his power. She had never needed his name. She had needed his attention, his respect, and his willingness to recognize her value. Meanwhile, Naomi Whitmore, Alexander's sister, began seeing Victoria differently as well. For years, she had accepted the assumptions surrounding the family. She had believed that protecting the Whitmore image was the same as protecting the family itself, but watching Victoria interact with Ethan and Emma changed her perspective. She realized that the woman everyone underestimated had shown more loyalty than many people who shared the family name. The Whitmore family slowly began confronting uncomfortable truths. They remembered the moments when they judged Victoria without knowing her story. They remembered the times they made her feel like an outsider. And they realized that their greatest mistake was not understanding her value before she walked away. Alexander knew he could not erase those memories, but he could choose what happened next. He invited Victoria and the children to spend more time together, not because he wanted to recreate the past, but because he wanted to build something healthier. He stopped trying to convince people that he had changed. Instead, he focused on showing it. Every conversation, every decision, and every moment of patience became proof of his transformation. Victoria noticed the difference. She saw that Alexander was no longer the man who believed love was guaranteed simply because someone stayed. He was becoming the man who understood that love had to be respected every day. The journey was not complete. There were still questions, fears, and memories that needed time. But for the first time in years, the Whitmore family was no longer built around silence. It was beginning to grow around honesty. And Alexander finally learned that the greatest legacy he could leave was not the power attached to his name, but the kindness attached to his actions. Alexander Whitmore once believed that rebuilding his family required one grand gesture, one perfect decision that could repair the years he had spent distant from the people who mattered most. But as time passed, he learned that trust was not restored through a single moment. It was restored through hundreds of small choices made with honesty and patience. Every morning, Alexander reminded himself that he was no longer trying to reclaim the life he once had. He was trying to earn a place in the life Victoria Bennett Whitmore had created without him. The difference was something he had never understood before. In the past, Alexander measured everything by what he could achieve. Now he measured his progress by the moments that showed the people around him felt valued. Ethan and Emma slowly became the greatest teachers in his life. They did not care about his reputation or the power attached to his name. They cared about whether he listened, whether he showed up, and whether he remembered the small details that mattered to them. Alexander found himself enjoying simple moments he once ignored, reading stories before bedtime, helping with school projects, sharing breakfast conversations where nothing involved business or family expectations. These moments seemed ordinary to everyone else, but to Alexander, they represented something he had missed for years. He was finally experiencing the parts of life that could not be bought. Victoria noticed the changes, but she remained thoughtful. She was happy that Alexander was becoming a better person, but she wanted to make sure his transformation came from genuine understanding, not fear of losing his family. One evening, she asked him a question that stayed with him. If everything had worked out differently, would you have changed? Alexander did not answer immediately. He looked toward the window, thinking about the person he used to be. I do not know, he finally admitted. And that is something I regret. I should have learned this lesson before I lost years with you and the children. Victoria appreciated his honesty because it showed growth. The old Alexander would have searched for the perfect response. The new Alexander was willing to admit uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family began a different kind of transformation. The people who once judged Victoria started seeing the qualities they had ignored. They saw the way she cared for others. They saw the respect people had for her. They saw that her strength never came from trying to prove herself. It came from knowing her own worth. The family gatherings that once felt formal and distant slowly became warmer. Conversations became more honest. Apologies were offered without excuses. Old assumptions were replaced with understanding. Alexander watched these changes quietly because he knew he was not the only person who needed to grow. The entire family had to learn that pride could separate people just as easily as distance. One afternoon, Alexander found the necklace that had started everything resting safely in Victoria's hands. He looked at it and thought about his mother. He realized that she had recognized Victoria's heart long before he did. The necklace was never about family status or tradition. It represented kindness, loyalty, and the belief that true family was created through love and respect. "My mother saw something in you that I failed to see," Alexander said. Victoria smiled softly. "Sometimes, people see the truth before we are ready to accept it." Those words stayed with him. Alexander understood that his journey was not about becoming a different person overnight. It was about continuing to choose better every day. He had spent years building a name that others admired. Now he was building a legacy that the people he loved could trust. And for the first time, Alexander Whitmore understood that the most valuable things in life were never the things he could control. They were the people he learned to cherish. Alexander Whitmore spent years believing that his greatest responsibility was protecting the legacy of his family name. He thought power, influence, and success were the things that would define him long after he was gone. But after everything he experienced with Victoria Bennett Whitmore and their children, he finally understood that a legacy was not created by what people remembered about him. It was created by how people felt because of him. The transformation did not happen overnight. There were no perfect moments where every mistake disappeared. There were only choices. Every day, Alexander chose to listen instead of assume. He chose kindness instead of pride. He chose honesty instead of protecting an image. And slowly, the people around him began to see the difference. Victoria noticed the man Alexander was becoming, but she also recognized something important. His change was not about winning her back. It was not about proving that he was still the powerful man everyone respected. It was about finally understanding the value of the people who had always been beside him. That was what made his actions meaningful. One evening, Alexander, Victoria, Ethan, and Emma gathered together for a quiet family dinner. It was not held in a grand room filled with important guests. It was a simple evening where everyone could laugh, share stories, and enjoy being together. Alexander looked around the table and realized that this was the moment he had spent years searching for without knowing it. Not another business achievement, not another public success. This, a family that felt real. A home that felt peaceful. Victoria watched him smile and saw something she had not seen in a long time. The pressure and distance that once surrounded him were gone. In their place was a man who finally understood that love could not be demanded. It had to be earned through care and respect. "I used to think losing control was my greatest fear," Alexander said quietly. "But now I know my greatest fear was becoming someone who could have everything and still fail to appreciate what mattered most." Victoria looked at him and smiled. She knew the past could never be erased. The years they lost would always be part of their story. But she also knew that people were capable of learning when they were willing to face the truth. The necklace that once represented a hidden chapter of their lives became a symbol of something new. It no longer represented secrets or unanswered questions. It represented the connection between generations, the love of a mother who saw kindness before anyone else, and the reminder that true family was built through compassion. Ethan and Emma grew up knowing a different version of Alexander. They did not know the man who once overlooked the people closest to him. They knew the man who read stories with them, listened to their dreams, and showed them that strength was not about being the loudest person in the room. It was about being someone others could trust. Victoria also continued her own journey. She remained the same woman who had always carried dignity, but now she no longer had to carry everything alone. She was no longer the person standing quietly in someone else's shadow. She was recognized for who she truly was. Years later, people still talked about Alexander Whitmore's success. They remembered the businesses he built and the influence he created. But the people who knew him best remembered something else. They remembered the moment a powerful man learned humility. They remembered the moment he understood that the people who seem the easiest to overlook are often the ones carrying the greatest strength. And that day, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.